All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I'm Rico Rutia, here with my co-host, Bryan Pfeiffer. Now, this week we have another special edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. This week, Bryan is going to report back from the Worker and Community Summit that took place in Neenah, Wisconsin yesterday. If you've been following our show the past few weeks, you already know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, you're about to find out. The Worker and Community Summit was exactly what the name suggests, a convergence of labor and community activists talking about how to build solidarity, support strikes, organize unions, and other very useful information for workers and community groups looking to stand up to corporate greed. So Bryan is going to fill us in on that after the music, and also after these three news bullet points, because these are still important. The first one is that the United Auto Workers are still on strike, and the strike has once again expanded. They have now added GM and Ford SUV plants to their strike. The second bullet point is that the studios in Hollywood are returning to the bargaining table to negotiate with SAG-AFTRA. And the third bullet point that I wanted to get in there this week is that in Colorado and in other states, Kaiser Permanente workers are poised to strike in 3 days. So keep an eye out for that. We will keep you updated on that. We'll update you next week on everything. Now, as always, we like to kick off our show with some culture, some music, something that'll get you thinking about the struggle, something that'll get you thinking about the labor struggle. This week, I would like to play everyone a little Utah Phillips. Utah Phillips is one of the great labor songwriters in the U.S., and I was at an event this weekend that played a song called Ship Gonna Sail that I wanted to share with everyone. Utah Phillips is also known for his storytelling, so I'm going to include that as part of the music today. I think it highlights how musicians and other cultural artists can contribute to the writing of working class history. That way we're not stuck with the history that's presented to us by our oppressors. So I'm going to leave that part in, enjoy the music, and we will be back with a report back on the Worker and Community Summit in Neenah, Wisconsin.
I think back on old Fred Thompson, the editor of the Industrial Worker. Man did a hard time in San Quentin Federal Penitentiary in the 1920s as a political prisoner for my union. And Fred talked to me sitting in the office in Chicago years ago about the First World War and the Espionage Act and the mass deportations without any due process and 5,000 union brothers and sisters in jail, the beatings, the lynchings. Said worse than anything we're going through right now, see. But we still came out of it with the structure of the 8-hour day, mine safety laws, and child labor laws. And you roll on up into the Great Depression, grinding oppression, right down on the bottom. But you have the birth of the CIO and the progressive movement, and what came out of that awful time, Social Security, workman's compensation, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, things unheard of anywhere. It come up through the war and into McCarthy times, the Red Scare, the beginning of the Cold War, when they tried to destroy the labor movement completely. And we came out of that. We survived. We came out of that, and we came out with the civil rights movement that worked, and the largest peace movement that the country has ever seen. So knowing that, nobody can tell me, I know that we're going to get through what we're going through now, and we're going to come out of it better and stronger, and you can count on it. We've done it before. And we've got a lot of help. We've got a lot of help to do that, when you think back down that road. We got people like Sojourner Truth and Mother Jones. Remember Mother Jones, the miner's mother, lived to be 100. Mother Jones in Philadelphia speaking at a mill. And they brought little kids to her, the workers, part of their hands missing, cut off by the machines, to scalp, hair caught in the machines and pulled their scalps off. She flew into a rage, went down to the Philadelphia Inquirer, said, we've got to expose this. The editor said, we can't do it because people own the newspaper, own the mill. Hasn't changed much, has it? Did she write to Congress? Did she start a petition drive? No, she got 100 of those kids together, marched with their parents, the chaperones, marched overland, 100 miles to New York City, caught the ferry across to Long Island, and those kids camped on President Theodore Roosevelt's front lawn to embarrass him into coming out in favor of child labor laws. Direct action gets the goods. Yeah. And Eugene V. Debs, I'm going to be having a meal over here at Turner's, over at the old Turnverein, where Gene Debs founded the Socialist Party of the United States. I love that man. There was never a man more loved in this country than Eugene V. Debs. There in court, telling the judge when he was on his way to jail for objecting to the First World War as a boss's war, and he looked at the judge and said, while there's a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal class, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. And on up to Maurice Sugar and the sit-down strikes of the 1930s in Detroit and Flint, Michigan, on and on. These people, I see them as they were building a boat. They were building a ship. And none of them believed they would ever sail on it. But it was no excuse not to build it. When they got too old and broken, tired to build anymore on that boat, they passed the skills and the tools on to the younger ones, and they kept building the boat. And now those tools are passed on to our times. They're in our hands, and we keep building that boat. When our turn comes, we'll pass those tools along, and someday that ship is going to sail. Someday that ship is going to sail to a world of economic justice and peace, and you can count on that too. Well, that's a mouthful. That's a mouthful. Thanks for being patient with me. I put all that together into a song, kind of a chant. I don't make songs like this very much, so I need help on it. Sojourner Truth said, ain't I a woman, ship gonna sail someday. Mother Jones said, no child labor, ship gonna sail someday. Joe Hill said, don't mourn organize, ship gonna sail someday. Gene Debs said, while there's a soul in prison, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, gonna build it anyway. Maurice Sugar said, sit down, ship gonna sail someday. Paul Robeson said, I won't stop singing, ship gonna sail someday. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, ship gonna sail someday. Malcolm X said, power to the people, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, gonna build it anyway. Cesar Chavez said, viva la huelga, ship gonna sail someday. Dorothy Day said, swords into plowshares, ship gonna sail someday. Judy Berry said, no compromise, ship gonna sail someday. Phil Berrigan said, no more atom bombs, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, gonna build it anyway. Well, they're all gone, and we're still building, ship gonna sail someday. With hand and heart and mind and muscle, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, ship gonna sail someday. Working on a ship, may never sail on, gonna build it anyway.
All right, everyone, what's up and welcome back. This is a special edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. In this edition, we're just going to chat with Bryan, interview Bryan, talk to him about how the Worker and Community Summit went in Neenah, Wisconsin this past weekend. The Worker Community Summit in Neenah, Wisconsin was a follow-up to a previous event that Bryan had organized called the People's Power Summit. And that's actually where this podcast came to being. We were able to converge a group of union activists and community activists. And at a certain point, Bryan, Jerry, and myself found ourselves talking about the history of the Salvadoran labor movement. And we found a little crowd gathering around us. And that's kind of, where the idea for this podcast came from. It's like, all right, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the international labor movement. Let's talk about labor. Let's talk about unions. Let's talk about workers' rights, workers' movements, all that. And, we've kept it going with the experimentation because we feel that this is something that's badly needed. And so this past event, the Worker and Community Summit, was part of that experimentation and part of the process. And speaking for myself, I was able to attend the People's Power Summit. And for me, I was telling Bryan that it was more than just an experiment. It was also just proof, proof that some stuff isn't that complicated. You can draft a press release and send it to all the local media. That still works. You can send a mass email to people who would be interested in an event. That still works. The Facebook events, those still work. Reaching out to people with paper flyers, that still works. All these tasks in organizing a big event, they're still relevant and they still work. And we see the evidence when these events come together. So that gets us to today, though, Sunday, October 1st. We're going to debrief with Bryan, see how the Worker and Community Summit went this weekend in Neenah, Wisconsin. Bryan, talk to us. How'd it go? What were your takeaways? What'd you learn? What'd you see?
All right, Rick, thanks a lot. Thanks for the background. And yeah, just take a little step back for listeners might not know about Wisconsin. I'm based in Madison now, working with Rick on the We Rise Fighting podcast here. And the Worker and Community Summit took place yesterday in Neenah, Wisconsin. And Neenah is in something called the Fox Valley, which has a long history of woodworkers, timber workers, paper workers, public sector workers, very rich and deep labor history there over the years, over the decades. And the Neenah Labor Temple is a sacred space for this type of work. The Fox Valley Area Labor Council president invited us in. We rented a room there. And this was a continuation, as Rick said, of the People's Power Summit. And as we've discussed previously on podcasts, we went into some research and found out, of course, Wisconsin has been hammered by austerity, Act 10, which eliminated collective bargaining essentially for public sector workers in 2011, and right to work was implemented in 2015. But also there's been a variety of fightbacks happening in the recent period, such as the Starbucks workers, the sourdough workers, the nurses that we've interviewed on the show here, and many that we've interviewed here in Rise Fighting, plus the national situation going down with the UAW, the Teamsters, Amazon workers, the writers, the many other workers across the country, academic workers going on strike. So we felt this was a time to seize the time to have a worker and community summit to bring together both union and community activists and participants in their organizations. And yesterday was a wonderful day. We had a great crowd, members of the steelworkers, UAW, Teamsters, IATSE, AFSCME, CWA, Starbucks workers, SEIU, and also many community participants from our Wisconsin Revolution, and many others showed up. And we had participants from Milwaukee, Madison, Appleton, Neenah, Fond du Lac, Sheboygan, Oshkosh, Manitowoc. So for listeners, this is the Fox Valley, like Lake Winnebago, and also Green Bay south to Sheboygan. And this has a great labor history. And we brought all these folks together. We had culture, we had food, we had music, beginning with the day. And then we had a series of panel speakers that discussed a variety of different activities that they were involved in. And this was appreciated by the audience. Everybody was intently interested in actual shop floor battles and struggles. So we had Brother Justin, who we interviewed here a couple weeks ago from CWA in Madison, who they won a contract. And in fact, that's now that contract is now in operation as of like this week, I believe. And we had Starbucks workers reports, detailed reports of what happened in the shop floor in the Starbucks. And there was a strike at a local there in Appleton, local Starbucks, and many others reported out on their battles, both the panelists as well as the audience members. So it's a great opportunity, and we let folks know that, as Rick said, some of this is experimental, but some of it was a learning lesson. And also, we always had our what we call our patron saint in many ways, Dr. King, there, and we honored him. And also, it was part of it was political education as well. Informing folks that Dr. King, if they didn't know already, died in Memphis, was assassinated in Memphis, supporting sanitation workers, and he spoke in more union halls than he did churches. And we had a variety of different literature there in support and solidarity of all kinds of different activities that were coming up. And that's what it was about, right? It was about unity and solidarity and building the workers' movement in concert with the community with a class struggle approach that we take here on We Rise Fighting. From an international perspective, when you walked in the hall, you saw banners and placards that had slogans like "No Borders in the Workers' Struggle," "Class Struggle in Session," pictures of Dr. King, placards that supported reproductive justice, and made these connections clear. And some made comments about formations that are taking place in the country, such as Southern Workers Assembly in North Carolina, and we've interviewed folks from there as well, and how these types of approaches are direly needed in Wisconsin today. We've previously talked about the density in Wisconsin for union membership, and it has plummeted after Act 10 and the right to work. And unions by themselves really never could be by themselves, but they always needed community support. But especially today, this is true more than ever. And so this was really a fundamental part of this summit, Rick, was to bring folks together and start having these conversations. And of course, we don't have all the answers, but we do know that one of the big answers is getting people together in a room like this at a labor temple to start talking and start strategizing and start figuring out how to go from here, because we're facing some pretty heavy situations and austerity in this country. And we know we have faith and confidence in the workers. And then if we get together with our community members and our faith-based partners, we can build a program and we can fight back in an effective way. So I'd say this was a very effective summit that we had, Rick. We're planning on following this up in April with something else, but I'll just leave it there. If you have any questions for me, you want to talk about a few things?
Yeah, I would love to actually. So can you, for the sake of either new listeners or people who are new to the labor movement, so tell us, how does this relate to the larger movement right now, to the larger labor movement? You already mentioned the Starbucks workers. They're very active in what's becoming, a lively labor movement right now. But so are Kaiser Permanente workers, so are UAW workers, so are graduate student workers. Things are coming to life again. So how does it relate to that, Bryan? How does this summit relate to that?
Yeah, Rick. So of course, our political outlook here, We Rise Fighting, informed this, and our programmatic orientation, but also this was inspired, just like our podcast here, was inspired by the workers on the move around the country, right? Especially workers under 40 that are all over the country, engaging in all kinds of activity from Amazon to Starbucks. And also this summit was inspired by Teamsters Local 662. So when we started to organize the summit, they were still on strike, and they were right down the road in De Pere and Chippewa Falls, and very courageous to go on strike in Wisconsin today. And of course, the national struggles. And then as we started to organize more for the summit, the UAW went out on strike. So one of the major things that we wanted to do with this summit is to, for those who might be new, just teaching like ABCs of what does solidarity mean? What does labor unions mean? What does solidarity mean in terms of community? So we had a lot of information there at the summit. For example, we had a flyer that said, how can you support the UAW workers on strike at the big three? And we had a list of all the ways that they could do that, showing up at a picket line in Milwaukee and Hudson. There's 2 locations right now, contributing to the strike fund, calling the CEOs, going to dealerships, taking caravans to the picket lines, and just having these types of conversations. And folks were really inspired by this. And there was a rich conversation about these types of activities and inspired by that. And then we took photo at the end of everybody holding up UAW signs in solidarity with the UAW strikers. And we sent that to various locals in Wisconsin and the UAW International. And folks were very happy about that. And I'd say to a person who spoke on the panel or spoke in the audience, every one of us, including myself, is very much inspired by what's going on in this country today, and workers not taking any shit anymore. The billionaire class, as Brother Sean Fain said, and is saying on picket lines and in his Facebook Live podcast, the billionaire class doesn't care about us. We have to get on the picket lines, and we have to go in direct action to the points of production and the points of service delivery and start organizing. And we can do that whether we have a union or not. And that was one of the things that we talk about here a lot, Rick, on We Rise Fighting to listeners, is just because you don't have a union contract doesn't mean you can't fight, right? And we learned that in depth when we interviewed our friends from North Carolina, the Black Workers for Justice and UE, which we raised up at the summit a lot, and the Southern Workers Assembly, which we had literature for that there, that they are organizing all over North Carolina and all over the South And in many places, they don't have collective bargaining contracts or even contracts at all, but they're winning all kinds of things because they're organizing together. Two workers or more makes a union, as you always say, Rick. And they're doing a lot of advances. And we can do the same thing in Wisconsin and around the country and unite with those who do have contracts and help each other. So the summit really reflected a lot of this. A lot of these conversations were taking place both, collectively in the on the panel and the participant section, where there was a question and answer session, and then sideline conversations and conversations at the table. And that's really what we wanted, right? We wanted to spark conversation. We wanted to spark like how how do we talk to each other? How can we get out into our communities and get this information out there? And people can get rent libraries for free. There's union halls. There's all kinds of ways we can have these events, have events in parks. And this is what we need to do, take back our spaces. These are our spaces, working class spaces, public spaces and libraries and parks. There's no reason these events can't happen all over the place. And ours was just a modest effort at continuing the People's Power Summit and contributing to what's going on around the country today.
Right on. You mentioned, the possibility of a follow-up event in April. What kind of ideas have been tossed around for that?
Yes, Rick. So we here at We Rise Fighting make sure that we always try to have cultural components and art involved. So part of that event would be similar to the People's Power Summit. Some folks have been kicking around the idea of maybe Friday night having some food, having some culture, getting to know each other. And that's what came out of this summit too, right? And everything that we try to do here at We Rise Fighting is we need to develop our relationships. And one of the things the capitalists want to do, of course, is isolate us and alienate us, right? And we need to do the exact opposite and develop our relationships and build those relationships. So to your question, Rick, like that Friday night would be to develop those relationships, to have food, break bread, to get to know each other, union members, community members, students, whoever wants to show up. And then Saturday, we would have a series of potentially political education, of course, cultural components, maybe panels, maybe some educational items like workshops, those types of activities. And we're going to be discussing this with our friends who have helped us build previous summits like we had yesterday. And we feel that this one we think is going to be in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which is also a very rich working class history there. And that's about 2 hours. It's about approximately 2 hours from Milwaukee and Madison, Fond du Lac, and both also Neenah as well. And so we're going to start to plan this pretty soon. And we hope our listeners are interested. Come out to Fond du Lac or help us plan this. And it's going to be very similar to what we did yesterday, just a little expanded version.
That's what's up, Bryan. So what do you hope were some of the takeaways for the people who attended?
Well, I think the importance of unity and solidarity and what does that mean? And taking leadership from the most oppressed and how critical and important that is. We held up at our summit, LGBTQ community, workers of color, union leaders of color, those who, women, of course, who are leading many of the struggles across the United States and are now involved in many of the organizing campaigns, not just as members, but leaders of national unions. So we had a lot of literature and discussion around that, and both also participation of women in the event as well as others, and the importance of learning the ABCs of what it means to be union and in support of unions. Like you don't cross a picket line. That if a union goes out on strike, that we support them whatever we can. If we can give them $1, we can give them $20 to the strike fund, or we can bring some water to the picket line. We can bring some food to the picket line. If we can get a resolution passed from our union local, or get community support, or ask our faith-based community institution, can they take up a food drive for the strikers, and those types of things. And that's what we were talking a lot about yesterday. Like when these things happen, how can we support our fellow workers when they're in need and when they're being courageous and brave and putting their lives at risk by going out and their loved ones on the picket line? How do we support them, and how can we do that in a way that's really going to uplift and build? And folks were extremely excited about things like, community caravans, car caravans, like what's happening during Black Lives Matter and a lot of the social movements in the country. And how can we take that spirit of the social movements that are happening, such as the LGBTQ movement fighting the anti-trans attacks or the attacks against public libraries, and uniting us together. It's the same capitalists and their same political servants that are attacking all of us. And we actually named some names yesterday, like a guy named Art Pope from North Carolina, who became the president of the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. As you say a lot, Rick, our enemies have names and addresses, and they are in many times in the same places doing the same things, just in different states or different cities. So folks appreciated that as well, that really undergirding our organizing with the research that's necessary, knowing who we're fighting and knowing how to fight in a way that's going to be effective. And then having some fun, having some culture, having some food, being in the streets, being in our neighborhoods, and being a part of the movement. And it's not just one union here, one union there. It's part of a labor movement, and it's part of and the labor movement is part of the people's movement. So how can we unite all of this together to build our power? And folks are really excited about that.
Right on, Bryan. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for debriefing us. I was unable to attend, unfortunately, but it sounded like a really worthwhile event and very experimental in extracting some of the lessons that working class people could benefit from right now in a struggle against corporate greed. So thank you for the debrief with us today, and we'll catch you again next week on We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. Thank you again, everyone. Love and solidarity to all.